The night sky over Denver was clear and cold when I stepped outside to catch some air, and that's when I saw her. My boss of 2 years, Renee Alcott, sitting completely alone on the hotel terrace with her hands trembling and her phone face down on her knee. The Hartwell & Associates Annual Leadership Summit was one of those events that looked better on paper than it felt in person. 4 days at a downtown Denver hotel, catered dinners, keynote speakers, team-building workshops, designed to make everyone feel like they were part of something bigger. For senior consultants and VPs, it was a networking opportunity, a chance to get their names in front of the right people. For someone like me, 28, barely 2 years into my first real professional job, still figuring out how to dress for client meetings, it mostly felt like 4 days of trying very hard not to say the wrong thing in front of people who could end my career before it really started. Before I go any further, I want to ask something of you. If you've ever been in a job where you couldn't tell if you were being challenged or being pushed out, this story is for you. Please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mercy Stories. Your support helps us keep telling the ones that don't make the headlines, but quietly change the direction of lives. Now let me tell you what happened on that rooftop in Denver. My name is Evan Thurston. Before I got to Hartwell, my life looked nothing like the polished LinkedIn profiles I scrolled through during lunch breaks. I grew up in a small town in eastern Tennessee, the kind of place where most people stayed because leaving felt impossible. My dad drove a delivery truck for 30 years. My mom worked part-time at the county library and took in ironing on weekends. They gave me everything they could, which, in practical terms, meant a state school scholarship, a used Honda Civic with one working window, and the belief that if I worked hard enough, I could build something for myself somewhere else. Getting hired at Hartwell felt like proof they were right. A mid-size management consulting firm with offices in Chicago, Denver, and Atlanta. Not the flashiest name in the industry, but solid, serious, the kind of place where real careers were built. I was hired as an operations analyst, which meant I spent most of my days building spreadsheets, combing through process reports, and trying to translate complicated data into language that actual human beings could understand. I liked the work. What I didn't like was my direct supervisor. Renee Alcott was the VP of Operations, which meant she oversaw my entire division and had the final word on every project I touched. She had been at Hartwell for over 2 decades, the kind of institutional knowledge that made her irreplaceable, but also the kind of accumulated authority that made her deeply intimidating to the people below her. She didn't yell. She didn't make dramatic scenes. She was worse than that. She was precise. When she found a mistake in your work, she didn't raise her voice. She just looked at you with this quiet, steady patience, like a teacher who has explained something for the 100th time and has simply accepted that some students will never understand. Then she would walk you through exactly where you went wrong, line by line, with a calm that felt more humiliating than anger ever could. Most people in the division kept their interactions with Renee short and professional. They answered her questions, sent her weekly updates, and otherwise stayed out of her way. I tried to do the same. But something about how she reviewed my work felt different from how she handled my colleagues. She flagged things in my reports that she let slide in other people's. She asked follow-up questions in team meetings that seemed specifically designed to catch me off guard. Once, I spent an entire weekend rebuilding a process analysis she had rejected, and when I resubmitted it, her response was 2 words. Better. Resubmit. Not good. Not approve. Better. Resubmit. After about 18 months of this, I started to wonder if I'd made a mistake coming to Hartwell. Not the industry, not the work, but the idea of spending my late 20s trying to prove myself to a woman who seemed constitutionally incapable of being satisfied made the whole thing feel exhausting in a way that went deeper than tired. 3 weeks before the Denver summit, I printed a resignation letter at the office printer on the 3rd floor. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The floor was mostly empty. I thought I was alone. I forgot to pick it up. The summit started on a Wednesday. I drove to the airport in the dark, caught an early flight, and arrived at the hotel with just enough time to drop my bag before the opening session. The conference space on the 2nd floor was set up with round tables, branded notepads, and the particular kind of aggressively cheerful energy that shows up when a company is trying hard to convince its employees that everything is going well. For the first day and a half, it was pretty much what I expected. Presentations on quarterly results, breakout sessions on operational efficiency, a team dinner at a steakhouse where I sat with 3 regional directors and spent most of the meal nodding at conversations I couldn't follow. Renee gave a 15-minute presentation on Thursday morning about a new cross-departmental reporting framework she had developed. It was sharp, well-organized, exactly what you'd expect from her. She answered questions without hesitation, made it look effortless, and walked off the podium with the same composure she walked into every room with. I watched her from the back and thought, not for the first time, that I had absolutely no idea what it was actually like to be her. Thursday evening was a cocktail reception on the hotel's rooftop terrace. String lights overhead, a clear view of the city, the usual end-of-conference loosening of formality that everyone pretended wasn't happening. I stepped outside around 8:30. I'd been sitting with a group of analysts for the past hour and needed 5 minutes where no one was going to ask me a question I had to think carefully about before answering. I found a corner near the far railing, away from the main crowd, and just looked at the city for a while. That's when I noticed Renee. She was sitting on one of the low concrete benches near the edge of the terrace, about 20 feet from where I was standing. I almost didn't see her at first. She wasn't in the main group, and she'd turned slightly away from the lights. But when I did see her, something stopped me cold. She was holding her phone with both hands, and her hands were shaking. Not trembling from the cold, not the way hands shake when you're tired. She was shaking the way someone shakes when they're trying very hard not to fall apart, and the effort of holding it together is the only thing keeping them upright. I stood there for a moment, not sure what I was seeing. Renee Alcott, who I had watched walk into a boardroom full of senior executives and dismantle a flawed strategy without raising her voice, was sitting alone at the edge of a rooftop terrace, shaking. Every reasonable instinct told me to walk the other way. She was my boss. She was the most intimidating person in my professional life. She had rejected my work more times than I could count, and had never once offered anything that felt like a personal moment between us. But something else in me, something quieter and older, the part that grew up watching my parents carry things they never talked about, walked toward her instead. I sat down on the other end of the bench, not close, not presumptuous, just close enough that she would know someone was there. She looked up. For a moment, her expression was the one I recognized from the office, controlled, evaluating, shutters pulled tight. Then something shifted, not a collapse, more like a fracture, small and clean, in something she'd been holding very tightly. She said my name, not a question, not a greeting, just my name, the way you say the name of someone you weren't expecting to find standing in a room you thought was empty. I told her I'd just come out for some air, that I didn't want to interrupt, that I could go back inside if she needed a minute. She shook her head. Then she looked back out at the city and went quiet. I didn't say anything. I'd learned from my father that sometimes the most useful thing you can do is stay close without demanding that someone fill the silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but barely holding. She told me that 2 hours ago, during the dinner break, she had received a call from the firm's executive committee. The committee had been reviewing a restructuring proposal that had been in development for 6 months. Something she'd known was coming but had believed, until that afternoon, she had successfully argued against. She hadn't. The restructuring would eliminate 7 positions in the operations division, her division. People she had worked alongside for years. People with mortgages and kids in college and 5 years until retirement. The announcement would be made to the broader company the following week. She had spent the past 2 hours sitting with that information alone, trying to figure out how she was going to stand in front of her team on Monday and tell them. I listened. I didn't try to fix it. There was nothing to fix. I just listened. And then she said something I wasn't expecting. She told me she had been fighting the proposal for 6 months, that she'd gone back to the committee 3 separate times with alternative cost structures, operational adjustments, anything that would preserve the headcount. She hadn't told her team because she hadn't wanted to create panic around something she still believed she could stop. She'd carried it alone because that was the only way she knew how to protect the people below her, by absorbing the uncertainty herself and not letting it touch them until she had no other choice. She stopped talking. The city hummed below us, indifferent and enormous. I sat with what she'd said, And then because it felt dishonest not to, I told her the truth about myself. I told her that 3 weeks ago I had written a resignation letter, that I had spent most of the past 18 months convinced she didn't respect my work, that I wasn't good enough for the role, that I was one bad quarter away from being let go anyway, and I might as well control the exit. I told her that leaving had started to feel like the only way to stop feeling like I was failing at something I genuinely cared about. She turned and looked at me fully for the first time since I'd sat down. There was something in her expression I'd never seen before. Not pity, not surprise exactly, more like recognition. The look of someone who has just heard out loud a thing they already knew but hadn't found the words for. She was quiet for a moment, then she said she knew. I didn't understand what she meant. She told me that 3 weeks ago on a Tuesday afternoon, she had gone to the third-floor printer to pick up a report she'd sent from her office. She found my letter in the tray instead. She said she only read the first paragraph before she realized what it was and stopped. But one paragraph was enough. I didn't know what to say. The cold air pressed in around us, and I felt the specific discomfort of being truly seen by someone whose opinion of you've spent months trying to guess. She told me she had wanted to talk to me about it after she found it, but she didn't know how to do that without making it worse. So instead, she'd done the only thing she knew how to do, which was push harder. Ask more of me, flag more of my work. Not to break me down, because she was trying, in the only language she'd ever learned, to show me that she believed I could handle more than I was giving myself credit for. Then she said something I didn't expect her to say. She said she had been wrong about that pushing harder without ever explaining why was not leadership. It was a habit she'd developed over 20 years in an industry that rewarded toughness and punished vulnerability. And she had never stopped to examine whether it was actually making the people around her better or just making them afraid. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel like all the hard months had been worth it because they'd led to this conversation. What I felt was something quieter. The specific ache of realizing that two people can be trying to do the same thing and still completely miss each other. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it slowly and held it out. It was a printed email, sent to the executive committee 7 weeks earlier, before I had any idea the restructuring was even being discussed. A formal recommendation, written in Renee's precise, unemotional style, outlining the case for promoting 3 junior analysts to senior roles in the operations division. My name was at the top of the list. The string lights swayed slightly in the wind. Someone laughed loudly from across the terrace. I read the email twice. Then Renee said something I will carry with me for a long time. She said, "I've been fighting for you since the day you got here. I just forgot to tell you." The plainness of it hit harder than any version of those words I could have imagined. No explanation wrapped around it. No apology softened by justification. Just the raw fact, offered without decoration. I folded the paper and held it back out to her. She shook her head, kept her eyes on the city. I asked her what she was going to do about the layoffs. She said she didn't know. That for the first time in her career, she didn't have a next move ready. That she had used every argument she had, and the committee had made their decision. And on Monday she was going to have to look people she cared about in the eye and tell them their jobs were gone. I thought about my dad, driving the same truck routes for 30 years because the factory that offered him something better shut down when I was 12. I thought about what it feels like to watch someone carry a weight they don't deserve and not be able to do anything about it. And then I said, "You don't have to walk into that room alone." She looked at me, really looked at me. I told her I'd been building a side analysis in my off hours for the past 2 months. Not for any assigned project, just because the numbers in our quarterly efficiency report hadn't been adding up in a way I could explain, and I couldn't let it go. I'd been trying to map where the operational cost overruns were actually coming from, because they didn't match the expense categories we were being given in the official breakdowns. I told her that if what I found was what I thought it was, there might be a case to bring back to the committee. Not a guaranteed one, but a real one with real numbers behind it. For a moment she didn't move, then she said, "Show me." We stayed on that terrace for another 2 hours, not as a boss and her analyst, as two people who were both, in different ways, trying to protect something they believed in. I pulled up the analysis on my laptop. She asked hard questions, the kind she'd always asked, but now I understood what she was doing. She wasn't trying to find fault. She was looking for the weakest points so we could strengthen them before anyone else did. By midnight, we had the outline of a proposal, not polished, not finished, but real. The committee meeting happened 2 weeks later. Renee presented the alternative framework. I sat in the back of the room as a supporting analyst, which meant I spent the whole hour carefully not making eye contact with anyone. The committee pushed back hard on the numbers, and when they did, Renee called on me directly to walk them through the methodology. I did. They took the proposal under advisement. 3 weeks after that, the restructuring plan was revised. 4 of the 7 positions were preserved. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was something. Afterward, in the hallway outside the conference room, Renee stopped me. She didn't say much. She said, "Good work." Then she walked away. In 18 months of working for her, it was the first time those 2 words hadn't been followed immediately by a correction. I stood in that hallway for a moment after she was gone, a little stunned, and then laughed at myself for how much 2 words could still mean. Things changed after that. Not dramatically, not overnight, but they changed. Renee started holding a short check-in with the junior analysts once a week. 15 minutes, nothing formal, just a chance for people to flag if they were stuck on something before it became a real problem. It was a small thing, but it changed the texture of the whole division. People stopped waiting until a problem was too big to hide and started asking for help earlier. The work got better, the teams got faster, and slowly, the atmosphere that had always felt like a held breath started to feel like something closer to momentum. She still wasn't easy. She still flagged mistakes. She still expected precision, but now when she pointed out what was wrong, she also explained why it mattered, what the impact was, what fixing it would make possible. The difference between being torn down and being built up is often just that, the why. Understanding the reason behind a correction changes what that correction does to you. A few months after the committee meeting, I was officially promoted to senior analyst. The title change came with more responsibility, a meaningful raise, and a Friday afternoon call from Renee, where she told me she expected me to be harder on my own work than she had ever been on it, because the standard I held myself to was the only one that would matter in the long run. I told her I understood. She said she knew I did. That was why she'd been fighting to keep me from day one. I've thought a lot about that night on the terrace in Denver, about what would have happened if I'd walked the other way, if I'd collected my drink and slipped back inside and let my boss sit alone in the cold with something too heavy to hold by herself. I don't think the only thing that would have changed was that one night. I think the direction of a lot of things, my career, her leadership, the jobs of 4 people in our division who still don't know how close they came to losing them, would have quietly shifted in ways that nobody would have been able to trace back to a single decision made on a rooftop on a cold Thursday evening. But here's what I actually believe, based on everything I've seen since. The things that change a workplace aren't usually the big announcements or the bold restructuring plans. They're the moments when someone decides to sit down next to a person who's struggling instead of walking past. Renee Alcott is still one of the most demanding people I've ever worked for. She still catches mistakes I wish she hadn't caught. She still has a way of asking a question in a meeting that makes you realize, instantly, that you should have prepared more thoroughly. But now I know what's behind all of it. Not indifference, not contempt. The same thing that was behind every rejected draft and every relentless round of follow-up questions for 18 months. A belief that the people in her division were capable of more than they were showing, and a deep, exhausted, imperfect commitment to being the person who would push them until they proved it. She just forgot to say so. And I almost left before I found out. If this story reached you in a moment when you're deciding whether to stay or go, whether in a job, a relationship, or anything else, where the effort doesn't seem to be landing, I hope it's worth something to you. Leave a comment and tell me about a time when someone's belief in you looked nothing like what you expected belief to look like. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, please subscribe to Mercy Stories. We're here every week. Because sometimes the most important thing you can do is sit down next to someone who's shaking and decide not to look away.